General Korak stood before the Imperial Council, his aged but battle-scarred body tense as he faced the rulers of the mighty Exelvar Empire. His dark eyes, filled with the weight of experience, scanned the room as he spoke. "Do not make them your enemy," he said, his deep voice carrying across the chamber. "Humans are not like the others. Their wars never end. Their soldiers never break. If we fight them, we will suffer losses that the Empire has never known." But the council members, dressed in their shimmering robes of power, laughed. To them, Korak was an old warrior, a relic from a past era, no longer useful in a time of grand conquests. High Chancellor Vorkal, his crimson scales gleaming under the chamber's golden light, smirked. "You give too much credit to a species barely crawling out of their own solar system. They have no war beasts, no enhanced warriors, no fleets that can challenge ours. Why should we fear them?" Korak clenched his fists, frustration rising within him. He had fought for decades, seen the rise and fall of civilizations, but never had he feared an enemy like humanity. He had witnessed their battles against the Grail, a species feared for its sheer brutality, and had seen firsthand how humans fought. Unlike the honor-bound warriors of the Exelvar, humans did not care for ritual combat. They did not meet their enemies on open battlefields in fair duels. No, they adapted, they learned, and worst of all, they refused to surrender. He took a step forward, his voice sharper now. "You think them weak because they lack our strength? But strength alone does not win wars. It is their mind, their will to survive at any cost, that makes them dangerous. They do not fight for the Empire, for titles, or for honor. They fight for each other, for survival itself. That is what makes them unstoppable." The council dismissed him without a second thought. The decision had already been made. The Empire would strike first, crushing humanity before it could become a true threat. A massive fleet was assembled, warships gleaming like stars in the darkness of space. Their destination was Vega 7, a human colony near the border. It would be a show of force, a message to humanity that the Exelvar Empire was not to be challenged. As the fleets departed, Korak could only watch in silence, knowing that his warning had fallen on deaf ears. When the Exelvar fleet arrived at Vega 7, the invasion began as expected. The planet's defenses were weak, its orbital stations easily destroyed. Imperial warships rained fire upon the cities below, turning towering skyscrapers into ruins. Troops descended from the sky, armored warriors marching through the streets, eliminating any resistance they found. It was supposed to be a swift victory, a simple conquest. But then, the humans began to fight back. At first, the Exelvar commanders were confused. They had destroyed the human military installations, yet the battle did not end. Their soldiers started vanishing one by one. Patrols would enter the ruins and never return. Gunfire echoed through the streets at night, but no enemy was ever seen. Supply convoys were ambushed, their vehicles reduced to smoking wrecks before reinforcements could arrive. The Exelvar had fought many wars, but this was something else. The enemy was not meeting them in open combat. The humans were striking from the shadows, using the ruins as their battleground. They were fighting a war the Exelvar had never trained for. Then the true horror began. The humans were not just hiding. They were learning. Every battle, every ambush, every skirmish they adapted. They studied their enemy, changing tactics with terrifying speed. Exelvar warriors soon found their weaknesses exploited, their armor pierced by precisely aimed shots, their formations broken by explosives placed in perfect locations. Even their elite shock troopers, genetically enhanced for combat, found themselves outmatched by human soldiers who moved with an eerie coordination, as if they already knew what their enemy would do next. Panic spread through the ranks. The mighty Exelvar war machine, built for dominance, was being torn apart by an enemy they had underestimated. Desperate, the fleet sent out a distress call, requesting reinforcements from the Empire. But by the time more warships arrived, the situation had worsened. Entire battalions had been wiped out. Exelvar officers, once proud and confident, were now filled with dread. Reports flooded in humans had begun targeting command posts, assassinating high-ranking leaders. Communications were breaking down. Morale was collapsing. The Excelvor forces, once so sure of their victory, now found themselves trapped in a war they could not win. Back in the Imperial capital, the Council received the reports with disbelief. Vega 7 was supposed to be an easy conquest, yet now the fleet was requesting evacuation. How could this be? How could a species so weak bring the Empire's warriors to their knees? High Chancellor Vorkal, his face once filled with arrogance, now showed signs of fear. "Send more troops," he ordered. "Crush them with overwhelming force." But even as reinforcements prepared for departure, one figure stood in silence, watching everything unfold exactly as he had predicted. General Korak stood at the edge of the war chamber, his heart heavy with the weight of knowing. They had ignored his warning. They had laughed at his fear. Now, the price was being paid. And the worst part? This was only the beginning. The Excelvor fleet descended upon Vega 7, like a storm, their warships cutting through the void with the confidence of an empire that had never known defeat. Plasma cannons roared as the first bombardments hit the surface, reducing towering human cities to fire and ash. Smoke rose in thick columns, darkening the sky as thousands of Excelvar warriors deployed onto the battlefield. Their armor gleamed under the dimming sun, their weapons humming with lethal energy. This was meant to be a swift victory, a demonstration of power that would remind humanity of its place in the galaxy. There was no reason to expect resistance. The first waves of human soldiers had already fallen. The enemy was weak, primitive in technology, unrefined in tactics. At least, that was what the Excelvor believed. But something was wrong. The humans should have been fleeing, surrendering, or hiding in fear. Instead, the streets were eerily quiet. Excelvor patrols moved cautiously through the ruins, their alien eyes scanning the broken landscape for survivors, but all they found were empty buildings and burning wreckage. Communications remained steady at first, squads reporting back with no sign of organized resistance. Yet, one by one, those voices began to go silent. It started as an anomaly. One missing patrol was unusual but not alarming. Then another unit vanished. And another. Within hours, entire squads had disappeared into the shattered remains of the city. No distress signals, no final words, just dead silence. Fear crept into the minds of the Excelvor commanders, an emotion they had not felt in a long time. This was not how a conquered world behaved. The first bodies were found at dusk. Excelvor warriors, their once proud armor torn open, lay sprawled across the rubble. Their weapons were still clutched in their hands, but they had not even been fired. Something had struck them with surgical precision, single, clean shots through the weak points of their armor. There was no sign of a struggle, no signs of panic. They had died before they even knew they were under attack. The realization sent a wave of unease through the invading forces. The humans were not fighting them head-on. They were hunting them. Night fell, and the Excelvor quickly discovered that the darkness belonged to the enemy. They were used to battlefields of order, formations of soldiers marching with discipline, weapons firing in coordinated bursts. But here, there was no order, only shadows and death. The humans did not move like soldiers bound by rules. They were ghosts, emerging from the ruins with lethal efficiency. They struck from behind, from above, from below, vanishing before a counterattack could be mounted. The Excelvor fired blindly into the night, their energy blasts illuminating empty streets and abandoned buildings. Paranoia spread like wildfire. Soldiers flinched at every sound, their nerves fraying as the minutes stretched into hours. Every dark corner, every pile of rubble, every whisper of wind could be hiding an unseen enemy. A squad of Excelvor warriors took shelter in a collapsed building, their commander barking orders through the static-filled comms. "Hold your positions. Stay alert. Do not let them separate us." But even as he spoke, the humans were already among them. A sharp whistle cut through the air, followed by the dull thud of a body hitting the ground. The commander turned, his blood running cold as he saw his second-in-command lying motionless, a single bullet through his skull. Panic erupted. The squad fired wildly, their weapons scorching the walls, but there was no target. One by one, they were picked off. silent, precise, merciless. Across the ruined city, similar scenes played out. Exilvor officers screamed into their radios, demanding reinforcements, but the responses were filled with panic and confusion. They're everywhere. We can't see them. We can't. The transmission cut off with a scream. The Exilvor had come expecting an easy war, a swift occupation. Instead, they had walked into a nightmare. This was no battlefield, it was a hunting ground, and the humans were the predators. By dawn, the once proud invasion force was in disarray. Entire platoons had been wiped out, not in open combat, but in relentless, invisible warfare. Reports flooded in traps placed in strategic locations, supply lines cut with ruthless precision, command centers infiltrated and destroyed. The humans were not just fighting back, they were studying their enemy, learning their tactics, exploiting their weaknesses. Every failed Exilvor attack taught them something new. Every attempt to regroup ended in disaster. They did not fight for honor or territory. They fought for survival. And in war, survival bred monsters. A desperate transmission reached the Imperial fleet in orbit. "This is ground command. We are under attack from all sides. Request immediate evac." The signal was cut off, replaced by static. The high-ranking officers aboard the flagship stood frozen, their minds unable to comprehend the scale of the disaster unfolding below. The humans were supposed to be weak. They were supposed to break under pressure. Instead, they had become something far more dangerous. They had become an unstoppable force. Far away, in the halls of the Exilvor Empire, General Korak sat in silence, listening to the reports with a heavy heart. He had warned them. He had told them what would happen. They had laughed at his fears, mocked his caution. Now, the Empire was paying the price. The first encounter with humanity had begun, and it was not a battle, it was a massacre. And the worst part? This was only the beginning. The Exilvor Empire had ruled the stars for centuries, crushing every opponent that dared to challenge its might. It had expanded across the galaxy with unstoppable force, its war machine consuming entire civilizations in its path. When news arrived of a young, emerging species called humans, the Imperial High Council barely gave them a second thought. They were primitive, barely beyond their own solar system, with no grand fleets or advanced weapons. The Empire's analysts deemed them insignificant, unworthy of concern. And so, when humanity refused to submit to the Empire's demand for surrender, the Council saw it as nothing more than the foolish defiance of an inferior race. With arrogance born from centuries of dominance, the Empire declared war, believing it would take no more than a single campaign to bring humanity to its knees. The invasion fleet launched with confidence, thousands of warships heading toward human space, their weapons primed for destruction. Their target was Earth, the homeworld of the humans, the heart of their civilization. The Emperor himself watched from his throne, expecting news of a swift victory. The first phase of the attack was flawless Exilvor warships, shattered orbital defenses, their plasma cannons reducing satellites and space stations to debris. Cities trembled under the initial bombardments, skyscrapers collapsing in fire and ruin. It was supposed to be over within days. The human military was outmatched, their technology inferior, their numbers insignificant against the might of the Empire. But then the true war began. The first sign that something was wrong came when the Exilvor ground forces landed. The Empire had fought countless wars, and in every one, their enemies had followed the same pattern after their defenses fell. They either surrendered or attempted a desperate, chaotic resistance that was quickly crushed. But the humans did neither. They did not throw themselves into hopeless charges, nor did they beg for mercy. Instead, they vanished. The streets of their ruined cities were empty, the buildings silent. There were no crowds pleading for their lives, no scattered survivors crawling from the rubble. It was as if the entire planet had been abandoned. The Exilvor generals were confused. This was not how wars were fought. Then, the disappearances began. Patrols sent to secure key locations stopped reporting back. Entire battalions vanished without a trace, their last transmissions filled with static and broken whispers. Supplies disappeared overnight, vehicles were found destroyed in the morning, and every attempt to locate the enemy led to dead ends. The Excelvor, for the first time in their long history, realized they had no control over the battlefield. The humans were not fighting a conventional war. They were fighting in the shadows, striking unseen and fading into the ruins before retaliation could even begin. At first, the Empire dismissed it as an inconvenience, a temporary setback. But as days turned into weeks, the losses became impossible to ignore. The mighty war machine of the Excelvar was being dismantled piece by piece, not by overwhelming force, but by an enemy that refused to be seen. Zelvor officers issued desperate orders, scorched earth tactics, mass executions, entire cities burned to the ground in an attempt to draw the enemy out. But nothing worked. For every human killed, 5 more seemed to take their place, each one more ruthless than the last. The Empire had believed they were the hunters, but now they were the prey. As the war dragged on, panic spread through the ranks. Zelvor soldiers, once proud and disciplined, became paranoid and afraid. They refused to patrol at night, whispering of ghosts in the darkness. Their officers spoke of unseen enemies, of whispers in the wind, of death that came without warning. Even their war machines, built for open combat, were useless in this kind of warfare. The humans were always one step ahead, always waiting, always ready to strike. The Empire had thought it would break the will of humanity. Instead, it was humanity that was breaking the Empire. In desperation, the Emperor ordered the withdrawal of his forces, his once mighty fleet retreating from human space in disgrace. But it was too late. The humans had learned everything they needed to know. They had studied the Empire's tactics, its weaknesses, its limitations, and now they were coming. The Excelvor had sought to conquer humanity, but instead, they had created something far worse, an enemy that had adapted to them, an enemy that had become stronger because of them. The war was no longer about survival. It was about vengeance. As the first human warships entered Excelvar space, their sleek, lethal designs built from lessons learned in the fires of war, the Empire finally understood its mistake. The folly of underestimating humanity had sealed its fate. And now, for the first time in its long and bloody history, the Excelvor Empire knew fear. The Excelvor Empire had never known defeat. For centuries, their fleets had swept across the galaxy, crushing resistance with overwhelming force. Every species they encountered had either submitted or been wiped from existence. It was a pattern that had repeated itself countless times. And so, when the Empire declared war on humanity, they expected the same result, a swift, brutal conquest that would end with another world added to their dominion. But this war had not gone as planned. What should have been an easy victory had turned into a nightmare. The humans had fought back in ways the Empire had never seen before. They had turned their ruined cities into traps, their streets into battlegrounds, their very existence into a weapon. The Excelvor war machine, built for direct confrontation, was failing against an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. And now, for the first time in their history, the Empire found itself on the defensive. The first sign of the turning point came when the Excelvor fleet gathered above Vega 9, one of their most important strongholds. It was a world covered in thick, towering forests, its surface dotted with military installations and supply depots. If the humans were going to strike back, the Empire reasoned, they would come here. And so, the Excelvor had fortified the planet, deploying legions of soldiers, setting up defensive turrets, and positioning their warships in tight formations above the surface. It was a trap, designed to lure humanity into a battle they could not win. But as the hours passed, there was no attack. No fleet appeared on the horizon. The humans were nowhere to be seen. The Excelvor commanders grew restless, waiting for the inevitable assault. And then, without warning, their defenses started failing. At first, it was small things: comms networks going dark, sensor readings showing nothing but static. Then, supply depots exploded in the night, their ammunition reserves detonating in massive fireballs. Patrol squads vanished, their last transmissions filled with confusion and fear. The Excelvor commanders scrambled to respond, issuing orders, repositioning troops, searching desperately for the enemy. But the enemy was already among them. The humans had infiltrated the planet, moving like ghosts through the thick forests, striking with lethal precision. The Zelvar soldiers, trained for open warfare, were helpless in this kind of battle. They fired into the darkness, but there was nothing to shoot at. Their own bases turned against them, their own supply lines were cut, their own machines sabotaged. The humans were not fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to win. Then, the real attack began. Human warships emerged from the void, sleek and fast, their hulls covered in advanced armor scavenged from the wreckage of Exilvor technology. They did not engage in a traditional battle. Instead, they struck where the enemy was weakest, hitting command centers, disabling capital ships, tearing apart the Exilvor fleet piece by piece. The Empire had always relied on brute force, on overwhelming their enemies with superior numbers. But now, it was the humans who dictated the terms of the war. They were faster, smarter, more ruthless than the Empire had ever imagined. Panic spread through the Exilvar ranks. Soldiers abandoned their posts. Officers screamed into their comms for reinforcements that would never come. The once mighty fleet above Vega 9 burned, its warships breaking apart as human weapons tore through their hulls. On the ground, entire legions of Exilvor warriors were slaughtered before they even knew what was happening. The forests became their graveyards, the ruins of their own fortresses turned into death traps. The humans gave no mercy. They had not forgotten the atrocities committed against them. The worlds burned, the billions lost. And now, they were here for vengeance. By the time the Exilvor High Command realized what was happening, it was too late. Vega 9 had fallen. One of the Empire's strongest bastions had been reduced to rubble. And worse, the loss was not just military, it was psychological. The invincible image of the Exilvor had been shattered. The galaxy had seen them lose, had seen them run in fear from the very species they had underestimated. Other civilizations, once too afraid to challenge the Empire, now saw an opportunity. Rebellions began to stir in the outer colonies. Old enemies of the Exilvor, once thought defeated, began gathering their forces. The war was no longer just between humanity and the Empire. The balance of power in the galaxy itself had begun to shift. On the Exilvor homeworld, the Emperor sat in silence, staring at the reports with cold, unreadable eyes. He had dismissed the humans as insignificant, just another primitive species to be crushed. But now, the reality was clear. The Empire had made a mistake that could not be undone. The turning point had come, and the war had changed. Humanity was no longer fighting for survival. They were fighting for victory. And if the Empire could not stop them, then for the first time in its long history it would fall. The Exilvor Empire had always seen itself as the ruler of the galaxy, a force that could never be challenged. Its war fleets had conquered countless worlds. Its armies had crushed rebellions before they could even begin, and its leaders had never once questioned their supremacy. When reports first came about humanity, they were dismissed without a second thought. The analysts scoffed at the idea that this young, unproven species could pose a threat. The Emperor himself laughed at the warnings from his advisors, calling them paranoid. Humanity was nothing, a primitive civilization that had barely begun to explore space. There was no need for caution, no need for strategy. The Empire would do what it had always done: demand surrender, and if refused, erase them from existence. It was a decision made in arrogance, a decision that would cost them everything. The first attack against Earth was meant to be a show of force, a demonstration of the Empire's overwhelming power. Zelvar warships descended upon human colonies, expecting them to fall without resistance. But instead of surrender, the humans fought back with a level of determination the Empire had never encountered before. They did not break under pressure. They did not beg for mercy. They adapted, they learned, and they turned every weakness of the Empire against it. The early battles were brutal, with humanity suffering enormous losses, but they did not stop fighting. The Empire dismissed it as desperation, convinced that the humans would eventually fall. They did not realize they had made a mistake. Not yet. The war dragged on. the Excelvor began to experience something they never had before defeat. At first, they ignored the signs. A lost patrol ship, a sabotaged supply line, a missing battalion, small inconveniences, nothing more. But the losses grew. Battles that should have been easy, victories became drawn out, bloody conflicts. The true cost of their ignorance became clear when humanity launched its first major counteroffensive. A fleet of human warships, built with technology scavenged from fallen Excelvor vessels, emerged from the void and attacked one of the Empire's key strongholds. The Empire, still blinded by arrogance, believed the battle would be over in hours. But as the fighting raged on, they began to understand the horrifying truth: humanity had not only learned from the war, they had become stronger because of it. Their ships were faster, their weapons deadlier, and their tactics unpredictable. The Excelvor were no longer fighting a primitive species. They were fighting an enemy that had surpassed them. Panic spread through the ranks. Soldiers who had once been fearless now hesitated. Generals who had once spoken with confidence now whispered in fear. The humans were not just winning battles, they were dismantling the Empire's entire war machine. The Emperor, who had once laughed at the idea of humanity being a threat, now sat in his throne room, silent, staring at reports of fallen worlds. The unthinkable had happened. The Empire, for the first time in its history, was losing. But the humans were not content with simple victories. They remembered the destruction of their cities, the deaths of their people, the arrogance with which the Excelvor had waged war against them. They had no intention of stopping until the Empire was broken beyond repair. One by one, the Empire's strongholds fell. The war was no longer about defense, it was about survival. And the Excelvor, who had once believed themselves invincible, now found themselves on the brink of collapse. As the last human fleet closed in on the Excelvor homeworld, the Emperor finally understood the truth. The war had never been about superiority. It had never been about numbers or firepower. It had been about the will to fight, the ability to adapt, and the refusal to surrender. The Empire had underestimated humanity, ignored the warnings, and believed itself untouchable. And now it was paying the price. The price of ignorance was extinction.